The desert stretched endlessly under the starlit Nevada sky, its silence broken only by the occasional howling of the wind. For friends, Elliot, a self-proclaimed conspiracy theorist, Lena, the tech genius, Mark, the skeptic, and Claire, the brave adventurer, sat around a flickering campfire. Their faces glowed with excitement and nervousness. "This is our chance to make history," Elliot said, pulling out a map marked with scribbled notes and GPS coordinates. "Area 51 is more than UFOs and aliens. There are secrets buried there, secrets no one else dares to uncover." Lena adjusted her glasses and tapped on her laptop. "I've hacked into some low-level surveillance networks. If we time it right, we can slip past the first layer of security." Mark scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You know we'll get caught. Or worse, what if nothing is there? What if it's just a boring military base?" Claire smirked. "And what if it's not? You've seen the rumors, Mark. Missing people, strange lights, unexplainable sounds. Don't you want to see it for yourself?" Reluctantly, Mark nodded. Deep down, curiosity gnawed at him. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would drive through the desert to an unmonitored entry point, hike under the cover of night, and reach one of the abandoned hangars marked on Elliot's map. It was supposed to be decommissioned decades ago, but recent satellite images showed faint activity. "Remember," Elliot said, his voice lowering, "we're not looking for aliens. We're looking for the truth." As the fire died out and the group packed their gear, a strange unease settled over them. The vast desert felt alive, as though unseen eyes were watching. "Are we really doing this?" Claire whispered as they climbed into the jeep. "We're already committed," Elliot replied, starting the engine. "Let's make history." The jeep rumbled across the uneven terrain, its headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The desert was eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a distant coyote. Claire leaned out the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. "This place feels wrong," she murmured. Mark rolled his eyes. "It's a desert. It's supposed to feel empty." Elliot tapped the dashboard nervously. "Keep your eyes on the road. We're getting close to the unmarked trail." Lena sat in the back, her laptop open and glowing faintly. The screen showed a map with a blinking dot, an indicator of their current location. "I've bypassed the first security drone routes," she announced. "We have a clear window for about 20 minutes. After that, we're on our own." The group fell into an uneasy silence as the jeep slowed to a stop. Ahead of them was the faint outline of a chain-link fence, rusted and sagging in places. A faded sign hung crookedly, its warning barely legible, "Restricted area. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." Claire grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from her backpack. "Time to get to work," she said with a forced smile. The fence gave way with a metallic groan, and one by one, they slipped through the gap. The air on the other side felt heavier, oppressive, as if they'd crossed into another world. "Stay close," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. "And whatever you do, keep your flashlights off. Use the moonlight." They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the sandy ground. In the distance, the silhouette of an old hangar loomed, a monolith in the desolate landscape. As they approached, the group began to notice strange details. The air grew colder, and a faint hum vibrated beneath their feet. Lena stopped abruptly, her face pale. "Do you feel that?" she asked. "Feel what?" Mark replied, though he, too, was starting to shiver. "It's like, the ground is alive," Lena whispered, staring at her laptop. "There's electromagnetic interference all around us. It's off the charts." Elliot grinned nervously. "That just means we're close to something big." But as they neared the hangar, a low, mournful wail carried through the air, sending chills down their spines. It was a sound unlike anything they had ever heard, part mechanical, part human. What the hell was that? Claire hissed, gripping her flashlight tightly. Probably the wind, Mark said, though his voice wavered. Elliot shook his head. That's not the wind. We need to keep moving. The group pressed on, but the wail grew louder, echoing in the stillness of the desert night. By the time they reached the hangar, their unease had turned into outright fear. The structure loomed over them like a shadow, its metal walls corroded and covered in strange scorch marks. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice trembling with both excitement and dread. "This is where it begins." The hangar's massive sliding doors stood ajar, revealing only darkness within. A faint metallic odor wafted out, mixing with the dry desert air. Elliot stepped forward, his flashlight barely piercing the black void. "Lena, any readings?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena glanced at her laptop, the screen flickering erratically. "The interference is getting worse. It's like the air itself is charged with static." Claire scanned the area with her flashlight. The inside of the hangar was vast, with walls disappearing into shadow. Rusted equipment and broken crates were scattered across the floor, and strange symbols were faintly etched into the concrete walls. "What do you think these mean?" Claire asked, running her fingers over one of the carvings. Elliot leaned in, his face inches from the symbols. "They look mathematical. Or maybe some kind of code." Mark, standing near the doorway, crossed his arms. "This is all just junk. An old base no one cares about anymore. Let's get some footage and go before we get caught." But as Mark spoke, a loud clang echoed from deep within the hangar. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just a piece of metal shifting," Mark said, though his face betrayed his unease. Elliot motioned for the group to follow him deeper inside. "We came here for answers. Let's not turn back now." Reluctantly, they moved forward, their footsteps echoing off the cold concrete. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to change. It felt thicker, almost suffocating, and the faint hum from before now resonated louder, as if it were emanating from the very walls. "Guys," Lena said, stopping abruptly, "look at this." In the center of the hangar stood a massive, circular hatch embedded in the floor. It was surrounded by an array of strange machinery, tangled wires, rusted levers, and blinking lights that shouldn't still be functioning. "That's not normal," Claire said, stepping closer. Elliot crouched beside the hatch, running his hands over its surface. "This looks like it was designed to stay sealed. Why is it still powered after all this time?" Mark frowned. "Maybe we shouldn't find out." But Lena was already typing furiously on her laptop. "This thing is connected to an old network. I think I can override the lock mechanism." "Wait!" Claire hissed. "We don't even know what's down there." Lena didn't stop. "That's exactly why we need to open it." As Lena worked, the humming grew louder, and the temperature seemed to drop. Suddenly, the lights on the machinery began to flash erratically. "Something's happening," Elliot said, stepping back. With a hiss of escaping air, the hatch unlocked and began to creak open. A foul, metallic smell rose from the depths, making them gag. "Lena, stop!" Mark yelled, but it was too late. The hatch fully opened, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase that descended into the earth. A cold, unnatural wind blew out from the opening, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her eyes wide with fear. "It's voices," Elliot said, his voice trembling. "Hundreds of them." Lena shone her flashlight down the staircase, but the beams seemed to vanish into the blackness. "Whatever's down there," she said, swallowing hard, "it's not supposed to be." And then, from deep within the darkness, a shadow moved. The group stared into the gaping void, the faint whispers growing louder and more distinct. They weren't in any language they recognized, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to echo directly in their minds. "We're not seriously going down there, are we?" Mark asked, taking a step back. Elliot tightened his grip on the flashlight. "We didn't come this far to stop now." Claire glanced at the shadowy staircase, her heart pounding. "This is insane. If something was locked down there, it was for a reason." Lena took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on her laptop. "The interference is strongest here. Whatever's below us, it's emitting some kind of signal. We have to find out what it is." Despite Mark's protests, the group began their descent. The metal stairs groaned under their weight, and the air grew colder with every step. The whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder as though the source was moving closer. The beam from their flashlights illuminated narrow, rusted walls lined with strange markings. Unlike the carvings in the hangar, these symbols were chaotic, almost frenzied. "What do you think these mean?" Claire whispered, running her flashlight along the markings. "I don't know," Elliot replied. "But it looks desperate. Like someone was trying to warn us." As they descended deeper, a new sound joined the whispers, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat reverberating through the walls. "I don't like this," Mark muttered, gripping the railing tightly. "Nobody does," Claire shot back. "But we're here now. Let's keep moving." After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom of the staircase. It opened into a massive underground chamber, its walls slick with condensation. The air was thick and almost unbreathable, carrying the stench of decay and metal. At the center of the room was a massive glass cylinder, filled with a swirling, greenish-black liquid. Strange machines surrounded it, wires snaking across the floor like vines. Inside the cylinder, a dark, humanoid shape floated, its features obscured by the murky fluid. "What the hell is that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Lena said, her hands shaking as she typed furiously on her laptop. "But this tech, it's way ahead of anything we have now. It's decades, maybe centuries, old." Elliot stepped closer, his eyes wide with fascination. "This is it. This is what they've been hiding." The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as the shape inside the cylinder began to shift. A pair of glowing, white eyes snapped open, and a piercing, inhuman screech filled the chamber. The group stumbled back in terror as the machines around the cylinder roared to life. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered wildly. "We need to get out of here," Mark yelled, but the staircase behind them was already shrouded in darkness. The figure inside the cylinder pressed its hands against the glass, its mouth moving as though it were speaking. But the words were incomprehensible, like a dozen voices speaking in unison. And then, with a shattering crash, the glass burst. The liquid spilled across the floor, hissing as it touched the metal. The creature stepped out, its form flickering between solid and ethereal, its glowing eyes locked onto the group. "Run!" Claire screamed, grabbing Lena by the arm. But before they could move, the creature let out another screech, and the chamber seemed to warp around them. The walls stretched and twisted, the whispers turning into guttural screams. "Stay together!" Elliot shouted, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed them whole. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the group in an instant. The air felt thick and oppressive, pressing against their skin as if they were submerged underwater. Elliot's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them with nothing but the sound of their own panicked breathing, and the whispers. "Claire! Lena!" Elliot called out, his voice shaking. "I'm here." Claire's voice echoed from somewhere nearby, but it sounded distant, warped. "Lena? Mark?" A faint groan came from the left. Elliot turned toward it, groping blindly in the dark until his hand brushed against something soft. "Elliot!" Lena's voice cracked as she clutched his arm. What's happening? Where's everyone else? I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark! Claire shouted. Her voice seemed closer now, but the oppressive blackness distorted its direction. I'm here. Mark finally replied, gasping. What the hell was that thing? The whispers grew louder, circling them like predators stalking prey. Words they couldn't understand filled the air, but their tone was clear, angry, mournful, desperate. Suddenly, a faint greenish glow appeared in the distance. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows on the warped walls of the chamber. Do we follow it? Claire asked, stumbling toward the light. We don't have a choice, Elliot replied, helping Lena to her feet. We can't stay here. The group moved cautiously toward the glow, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the space around them. The walls seemed alive, rippling like water with every step. What is this place? Lena whispered, her voice trembling. It's not just underground, Elliot said, his voice grim. It's something else. A pocket dimension, maybe. Or a prison. Prison for what? Mark asked, his voice rising in panic. Before Elliot could answer, the glow ahead of them flared, revealing a massive archway etched with the same chaotic symbols they'd seen earlier. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, and the whispers turned into agonized screams. We shouldn't go through that, Mark said, backing away. Do you have a better idea? Claire snapped, grabbing his arm. As they hesitated, a deafening roar erupted behind them. The creature from the cylinder was there, its glowing eyes blazing with rage. Its form shifted constantly, flickering between solid and spectral, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally. Run! Elliot yelled. The group bolted toward the archway, the air growing heavier with every step. The creature let out another screech, and the walls around them trembled violently. As they passed through the archway, the light engulfed them, blinding and searing. For a moment, it felt like they were being torn apart, every molecule of their bodies stretched to its breaking point. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. They found themselves in a new chamber, smaller but no less unsettling. The walls were lined with glass cases, each containing grotesque, humanoid figures. Some were half-formed, others mutilated beyond recognition. Their eyes followed the group, glowing faintly in the dim light. What is this? Claire asked, her voice barely audible. It's not a prison, Lena said, her face pale as she stared at the figures. It's a lab. From behind them, the creature's screech echoed again, closer this time. It's not done with us yet, Elliot said grimly. We need to keep moving. The group stumbled deeper into the unsettling chamber, their breaths shallow and labored. The air was thick with an acrid stench, a mix of chemicals and decay. The glass cases lining the walls seemed to hum faintly, their contents illuminated by a sickly green light. Lena paused in front of one of the cases, her face contorted with both horror and fascination. Inside was a figure that resembled a human but was horribly distorted, its limbs stretched at unnatural angles, its skin translucent, revealing a web of dark veins beneath. Its eyes, dull and lifeless, were locked on hers. They were experimenting, she whispered, her voice trembling. On people. Claire turned away, clutching her stomach. This is sick. We need to get out of here. Elliot approached another case, running his flashlight over the inscriptions etched into its metal frame. These markings, he murmured. They're a mix of symbols and numbers. Like some kind of experiment ID. Mark stood near the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists. Whatever they were doing here, it wasn't just science. This is, he trailed off, unable to find the words. The creature's screech echoed again, this time louder and closer. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and the figures in the glass cases shuddered as if responding to the noise. "We don't have time to figure this out," Claire said, grabbing Elliot by the arm. "We need to move before that thing finds us." But Lena was already scanning the room with her laptop, her fingers flying over the keys. "Wait," she said, her voice urgent. "There's a console over there. If I can access it, I might be able to figure out what's going on, and how to stop that thing." Claire hesitated, torn between the need to escape and the chance to uncover the truth. "You've got 2 minutes," she said finally. "Then we're leaving, with or without you." Lena sprinted to the console, a rusted, blinking terminal embedded in the far wall. As she connected her laptop, the screen flickered to life, displaying streams of code and fragmented files. "This system is ancient," she muttered. "But it's still running. Give me a second." Elliot stood guard near her, his flashlight scanning the room nervously. Mark and Claire moved toward the far end, searching for another exit. Lena's face paled as she read the data scrolling across her screen. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What?" Elliot asked, leaning over her shoulder. "This place, it wasn't just a research lab," Lena said, her voice shaking. "It was a containment facility. They weren't just experimenting on people. They were trying to merge human and something else. Something not from here." "Aliens?" Elliot asked, his voice hushed. Lena shook her head. "No. Worse. Whatever they brought here, it doesn't belong in this reality. It's unstable. Dangerous." Before she could say more, the creature's screech tore through the room, followed by the sound of shattering glass. "It's here!" Mark yelled, pointing toward the doorway. The creature emerged from the shadows, its body shifting and stretching as it moved. The figures in the glass cases twitched violently, their eyes glowing brighter as the creature approached. "Run!" Claire shouted, pulling Lena away from the console. The group bolted toward a narrow corridor at the back of the room, the creature's screeches echoing behind them. The walls around them pulsed and warped, as though the facility itself was alive and reacting to their presence. As they sprinted down the corridor, Lena shouted over the chaos. "It's feeding off the energy of this place. If we don't find a way to shut it down, we're never getting out of here." Elliot glanced back at the creature, its glowing eyes locked onto them. "Then we need to find the control room, wherever it is." The corridor split into 2 paths ahead, both equally dark and foreboding. "Which way?" Claire shouted. Lena checked her laptop, her hands shaking. "Left. Go left." The group veered left, the sound of the creature's pursuit growing louder. The corridor opened into another large chamber, this one filled with rows of consoles and monitors. "This has to be it," Lena said, rushing to the nearest console. But before she could begin, the creature appeared in the doorway, its form writhing and expanding as it let out another ear-piercing screech. "Hold it off!" Lena shouted. "I just need a minute." Claire grabbed a broken metal pipe from the floor, her knuckles white as she faced the creature. "We don't have a minute." The chamber was vast and dimly lit, its walls lined with ancient machinery that hummed with a life of its own. Monitors flickered erratically, displaying incomprehensible data and distorted images. At the center of the room stood a massive console, its screens glowing faintly with a greenish hue. Lena darted toward the console, her laptop already connected to the system. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she muttered under her breath, sweat dripping from her brow. "We don't have much time," she shouted. "This system is barely holding together." Behind her, the creature stepped fully into the room, its glowing eyes scanning the group. Its body flickered between forms, human one moment, monstrous the next. The air around it seemed to ripple with heat and static, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Mark swung a loose pipe at the creature, but it moved impossibly fast, dodging the attack and letting out a guttural growl. The pipe clanged uselessly to the floor as Mark stumbled back. "Distract it!" Claire yelled, grabbing a piece of debris and hurling it toward the creature. It didn't flinch, its glowing eyes fixed on Lena at the console. "It's going after her!" Elliot shouted, stepping in front of Lena. He waved his flashlight at the creature, the beam flickering as if the light itself was afraid. "Just buy me some time," Lena pleaded, her voice cracking. The creature lunged, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it swiped at Elliot. He ducked, barely avoiding the attack, and rolled to the side. The floor where the creature struck cracked and sizzled, leaving behind a smoking, blackened scar. Claire grabbed a fire extinguisher from the corner and sprayed it at the creature. The cloud of white foam momentarily disoriented it, giving Elliot and Mark a chance to regroup. "Keep it distracted," Lena yelled. "I've almost got access to the core system." "What's the plan?" Claire asked, her voice strained as she hurled another piece of debris at the creature. Lena didn't look up. "If I can override the power grid, I might be able to force a shutdown. It'll kill the containment system, but it might also destabilize whatever's keeping this thing tethered here." "Might?" Mark shouted, dodging another swipe from the creature. "It's our only shot." The creature let out a deafening screech, its form expanding and warping. It lunged again, this time slamming into the console. Sparks flew as Lena shielded her laptop, the screens flickering violently. "No, no, no!" Lena shouted, frantically typing. Elliot charged at the creature, slamming it with a metal chair. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its glowing eyes toward him, its mouth twisting into something that almost resembled a grin. "Elliot, get back!" Claire screamed, pulling him away just as the creature lashed out. Lena let out a triumphant cry. "I've got it! The core's exposed. I just need to." Her words were cut off as the creature turned its attention back to her. It moved faster than anyone could react, its elongated limbs reaching for her. Mark threw himself in its path, taking the brunt of the attack. The creature's hand slammed into his chest, and he screamed in agony as his body convulsed, a blackened mark spreading across his skin. "No!" Claire shouted, grabbing Mark as he collapsed to the floor. The creature turned toward Lena again, but this time, Elliot was ready. He grabbed a live wire dangling from the console and jammed it into the creature's side. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar as electricity surged through its body. It writhed and shrank back, its form flickering violently. "Now, Lena!" Elliot shouted. Lena slammed her hand down on the console. A deafening alarm blared as the lights in the room turned blood red. "System overload initiated," a robotic voice announced. "Containment destabilization in progress." The chamber began to shake violently, and the creature screeched, its form distorting even further. The walls around them warped and cracked, revealing a swirling void beyond. "Everyone, move!" Claire shouted, dragging Mark toward the exit. Lena grabbed her laptop and bolted after them, the console exploding behind her in a shower of sparks. The group sprinted down the corridor as the facility crumbled around them. The creature's roars echoed in the distance, mingling with the sound of collapsing metal and the hum of the destabilizing containment field. As they reached the staircase leading back to the hangar, the floor beneath them began to split apart, revealing the same greenish void that had consumed the chamber. "Go, go, go!" Elliot yelled, pushing Lena up the stairs. The group scrambled upward, the roaring void and the creature's screeches chasing them every step of the way. When they finally burst into the open air of the desert, the facility behind them imploded with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave that knocked them to the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. The desert air was suffocating, thick with dust and the faint scent of burning metal. As the last echoes of the facility's collapse faded into silence, the group lay sprawled on the ground, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling. Claire was the first to sit up, coughing as she wiped the dirt from her face. Her eyes darted toward the horizon, where the remains of the complex lay in ruins, a cloud of smoke and dust rising into the sky. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Elliot struggled to his feet, his legs shaky, his body bruised and battered. He looked toward the wreckage. "I think so. The containment system's gone. That thing, whatever it was, it's probably gone too." Lena sat up beside him, her laptop clutched tightly in her hands. She was pale, but her eyes were focused. "We can't be sure. The data on the core was fragmented, but I'm pretty sure whatever that thing was, it wasn't alone. If it was part of some larger project." "Great," Mark muttered, groaning as he sat up. His chest was still raw, his skin burnt in places where the creature had touched him. "So there's more of these things?" "We don't know," Lena said, her voice quieter now. "But I'm starting to think this whole facility was just one part of something much bigger. And if we don't figure out what it was really trying to do, we might not be done with it." Mark rubbed his eyes. "I don't want to hear about any more monsters, Lena. We've been through hell. I'm done." Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "I don't think any of us are done. But we need to get out of here. We need to figure out what the hell happened." "Yeah, well, the government's going to want answers, too," Elliot added, his voice cold. "And they'll probably want us silenced before we get the chance to talk." Lena frowned. "We don't have to go to them. I can work from the outside. I have enough data to—" "No," Elliot interrupted. "They'll be monitoring everything. You heard those alarms in there. They'll know what happened." The wind howled through the desert, stirring up the dust and carrying with it the scent of something familiar, something almost electric. Elliot glanced at the others, his face hardening with resolve. "We don't have time to argue. We need to move. Now." With no other choice, the group stood together and began to head back toward their car, their steps slow and uncertain. The landscape stretched before them, empty, desolate, as though nothing had ever been there at all. As they reached the vehicle, Lena hesitated, turning back toward the wreckage. The sinking feeling in her stomach grew heavier with every passing second. There was something she hadn't told the others, something important. "Lena?" Claire called, her voice distant. Lena shook her head, forcing herself to turn away. She climbed into the car without saying another word. As the engine roared to life and the group drove off into the barren landscape, the last remnants of the destroyed facility disappeared into the distance. The group fell into an uneasy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. They had survived the horrors of Zone 51, but the truth of what they had uncovered was far from over. Somewhere, out there in the vastness of the desert, something was still waiting. And they had just become part of a much darker story than they could ever have imagined. The desert road stretched endlessly before them, the heat shimmering off the cracked asphalt. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the barren land. Inside the car, the air was thick with tension. No one spoke as they drove in silence, the weight of the events at Zone 51 hanging over them like a storm cloud. Lena sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the edge of her laptop case. She hadn't opened it since they left the wreckage. The data on that laptop was crucial, but it was also a double-edged sword. If they couldn't figure out how to handle it, they'd only be digging themselves deeper into danger. Mark sat in the back, staring out the window, his expression distant. He'd barely said a word since the creature's attack, his body still trembling from the physical and psychological toll. Elliot's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. His eyes flickered between the rearview mirror and the road ahead, a constant watchfulness in his movements. He was thinking about the government, about the people who had sent them into that hellhole in the first place, and the ones who would come after them now. Claire, sitting next to Mark, was the first to break the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the engine. "Do you think we're safe?" Lena glanced over, her eyes tired but determined. "Safe? No one is safe from what we saw down there. We've just scratched the surface. Whatever they were doing at that facility, it's bigger than we think. And if it's still out there..." Elliot cut her off. "We don't know what's out there. It's gone, Lena. That thing, that creature, is gone. But how can you be sure?" Lena shot back, her voice rising. "You saw what it could do. What it was capable of. And we don't even know if it was the only one. Don't you think we've been through enough?" Mark muttered, turning his head to glare at her. "If you keep going on like this, we'll end up in a psych ward. I don't want to hear about it anymore. I'm done." Lena opened her mouth to respond, but Claire placed a hand on her arm, silencing her. "Mark's right. We can't keep going in circles. Whatever happened, happened. We need to figure out how to move forward." Lena exhaled sharply, slumping back into her seat. "We need answers. But not from the government. They'll bury us before we even get a chance to speak." Elliot nodded, his eyes locked onto the road ahead. "That's why we need to go off the grid for now. We'll take the data somewhere safe, somewhere they can't touch." Lena turned toward him, surprised by the resolve in his voice. "You're talking about going underground? Hiding from the people who sent us there in the first place?" Elliot's gaze hardened. "We don't have a choice. They're not going to let us walk away from this. They're going to want control of that data. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." "Control?" Mark scoffed. "What are they going to do with it? Turn us into more lab rats?" "I don't know," Elliot said, his voice low. "But I do know that if we stay in the open, we're dead. That creature, the experiments, they're not just some accident. Someone is pulling the strings, and we're not the first people to be caught in this web." Lena looked down at her laptop, the weight of the information inside it pressing heavily on her mind. She hadn't fully processed everything, but she knew one thing for sure: what they had uncovered at Zone 51 was just the beginning. "The facility's just one part of something much bigger," she said quietly, almost to herself. "A whole network of research sites, maybe all over the country, maybe worldwide." "Great," Mark muttered, his voice laced with sarcasm. "So now we've got a global conspiracy on our hands. What's next, alien invasions?" "It's not aliens," Lena said firmly, her voice tinged with both fear and certainty. "It's something worse. And if we don't stop it, it's going to keep spreading. And we'll never be safe again." Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered. The engine sputtered. "What the hell?" Elliot swore, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as the car jerked forward. Before he could react, the headlights went out completely. The car coasted to a slow stop, the only sound the faint hiss of the tires against the gravel. "What's happening?" Claire demanded, panic rising in her voice. Elliot tried the ignition again, but the car wouldn't start. "I don't know," he muttered, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. Lena grabbed her laptop, her eyes scanning the road ahead. "We need to get out. Now." Claire's hand shot to the door handle. "What's going on? Why would the car?" The air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as an unsettling hum filled the air. A distant light appeared on the horizon, faint at first but growing stronger, brighter. "Is that a car?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Lena said, her voice tight with fear. "That's not a car. It's something else." The light continued to grow, and the hum turned into a low, rumbling growl. The sound seemed to reverberate through the ground, through their bones. "Get out!" Elliot yelled, throwing open the car door. "We need to run." But before anyone could move, the light exploded into an overwhelming brilliance, blinding them as the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, as though something enormous was rising from the depths of the earth. And then, everything went black. The first thing Lena noticed when she regained consciousness was the silence. It was an oppressive stillness, almost unnatural in its depth. The hum, the vibrations, the growl, they were all gone. She opened her eyes slowly, wincing against the sudden light. The world around her was unfamiliar, vast, barren, and eerily empty. The desert stretched for miles in every direction, but something was wrong. It felt wrong. She pushed herself up from the ground, her head spinning, her body sore. Her hands scraped against something cold and metallic as she steadied herself. The others were still unconscious around her, scattered across the desert floor. "Claire. Mark. Elliot." Lena called, her voice hoarse. There was no response. Lena's pulse quickened. She staggered to her feet, scanning the horizon. The light from the explosion, if that's what it had been, was gone, but the air around her shimmered, as if the world itself had shifted. What happened? Her eyes caught movement. A figure, crouched a few feet away, slowly rising to its feet. It was Mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion. "Mark," Lena said urgently. "Are you okay?" Mark blinked, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Lena, where are we? What's going on?" "I don't know," Lena replied, trying to steady her breathing. "We were in the car, and then there was that light, and..." Her words trailed off as she looked around, her stomach sinking. The desert had changed. The once barren landscape now seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. The sky was no longer its usual blue, it was a strange shade of violet, and there was a heavy, almost oppressive feeling in the air. "I don't like this," Mark muttered, rubbing his eyes. "This doesn't feel like the desert anymore." Before Lena could respond, a sound shattered the silence, distant, but unmistakable. It was a low, guttural growl, like something was stirring beneath the earth. "No," Lena whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "It can't be." Mark turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. "Is that what we think it is?" "I don't know," Lena said, swallowing hard. "But I don't think we're alone." Suddenly, Claire groaned, stirring beside them. She sat up slowly, her face pale and covered in dust. "What the hell happened?" she murmured, looking around with wide, confused eyes. "Where are we?" Lena stepped forward, helping her to her feet. "We don't know. But something's wrong. We need to find the others and figure out how to get out of here." Just as Lena finished speaking, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the desert. The ground beneath them split open with a loud roar, and the earth trembled once again. "Get down!" Lena screamed, pulling Claire to the ground as the fissure widened. The very earth seemed to tear apart as something enormous began to emerge from the rift. The sound was deafening now, a roar that seemed to reverberate through their bones. Something massive, something alien, was pushing its way through the ground, its form dark and shifting like smoke in the air. "Move!" Elliot's voice cut through the chaos, and Lena looked up to see him charging toward them, his eyes wild with panic. Before Lena could react, a huge shadow loomed over them. The creature that had attacked them in Zone 51 was back, its form now even more twisted, its body writhing as it emerged from the rift. Its eyes burned with an unearthly light, and its shape seemed to flicker and distort with every passing second. Lena's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet. "We need to run, now." But as they turned to flee, the ground beneath them split open again, and the creature's massive form surged forward, blocking their escape. "There's no way out," Mark said, his voice hollow. We're trapped. Lena turned to him, panic rising in her chest. We can't be. There has to be a way. But the creature advanced, its growls growing louder, its eyes locking onto them with a hunger that chilled Lena to the core. As they backed away, trying to find some sort of cover or escape, Lena caught a glimpse of something in the distance, another figure, standing at the edge of the desert. It was a man, cloaked in shadows, his face hidden beneath a hood. His presence seemed to radiate power, a strange energy that filled the air. Before Lena could say anything, the figure raised his hand, and the world seemed to freeze. The creature stopped moving, its form flickering as if caught in a glitch. The air became still, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, the figure spoke. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice low and calm, yet filled with an undeniable force. This place is not meant for your kind. Lena stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. She glanced at Mark, Claire, and Elliot, all of them equally stunned by the sudden appearance of this mysterious figure. Who are you? Lena managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The figure lowered his hood, revealing a face that was both human and not. His features were distorted, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I am the keeper of the void, he said softly. And you are trespassing on a world you do not understand. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The growl of the creature behind them started to fade, but the tension in the air remained. And then the man spoke again, his voice full of warning. You have unleashed something that cannot be controlled. And now, you must pay the price. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble once again, but this time, it was not just the earth that was shaking. It was everything, the very fabric of reality itself. Lena could feel it, a pull, a rip in the air that threatened to tear everything apart. And she realized, with growing horror, that their journey had only just begun. The air around them vibrated with an energy that was almost tangible. Lena could feel her heart racing, her breath shallow as the keeper's gaze never wavered. There was a strange sense of inevitability in the way he looked at them, as though their fate had already been sealed, their actions long decided. The creature, still looming behind them, seemed to hang in the balance, frozen in place. Its form shifted like smoke, the edges of its body blurring as if caught between dimensions. Lena could feel its hunger, its rage, radiating in waves, but it didn't move. Lena's throat tightened. What do you mean, pay the price? The keeper's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You have disturbed the natural order of things, he said, his voice deep and resonant. This place, this void, it is not meant to be opened by your kind. The rift you've created has awakened something far older, far more dangerous than you could comprehend. Elliot stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. So, you're saying we're responsible for all this? He motioned at the swirling, pulsating rift behind them. That creature. The government experiments. The whole damn thing. The keeper's eyes flickered for a moment, as if considering the question. In part. You've touched something that was never meant to be touched. You have opened a door that cannot be closed. What you saw at Zone 51, what you encountered, it is just the beginning. Claire's voice trembled as she asked, then how do we stop it? How do we fix this? The keeper's expression darkened, and for the first time, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, flashed in his eyes. Some things cannot be fixed. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut again. You have already awakened forces that will not rest until they have consumed everything in their path. Lena's mind raced. So, what? We're supposed to just give up. Let whatever this is take over. The keeper's gaze turned to her, and for a moment, Lena felt a weight settle in her chest, like an invisible hand pressing down on her. You have no choice but to face what you have unleashed. There are no easy answers. The only way to survive is to go deeper. To seek out the origin of the rift and find what was lost. But know this, every step you take will bring you closer to destruction. Mark shuddered, looking over his shoulder at the creature still frozen in place. That thing, it's not just a freak accident, is it? It's connected to whatever the hell is going on here. The keeper nodded slowly. The creature you saw, it is a product of the rift. It was not born, it was made. And it is only one of many. There are others, far worse than this one. And they will be coming for you. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much larger than they could imagine. But why us? Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did we stumble into this? We were just trying to get footage, to expose the truth. We had no idea what we were walking into. The keeper studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. It is not a matter of choice. It is fate. You are the ones who opened the door, and now you must deal with the consequences. But how do we stop it? Elliot demanded, frustration creeping into his voice. You're telling us all this, but you're not giving us any way out. The keeper's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled pity. The path you seek is dangerous. It will lead you to places you cannot comprehend, to truths that will shatter your understanding of reality. But if you are determined, you must travel to the source. To where the rift began. Only then can you hope to understand what has been set in motion. A low, bone-chilling growl broke through the conversation, and the creature shifted, its form snapping back into focus. Its eyes burned with malice, and the temperature around them dropped. It was no longer frozen. The keeper raised a hand, and with a single, fluid motion, the creature stopped in its tracks. You are not ready, he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. This will not be the end. But it is a warning. A chance for you to turn back. Lena swallowed hard. She didn't feel ready. Hell, none of them did. But there was no turning back now. They had already crossed the threshold. The keeper lowered his hand, and the creature vanished into the rift, its growls fading into the distance. The ground stopped shaking, and the air began to settle. For a moment, everything was still again. The keeper turned away, his form beginning to blur and distort, as if he were fading from existence. Find the origin, he said, his voice growing faint. And remember, the rift has eyes. It is always watching. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Wait. How do we find it? How do we even know where to go? The keeper didn't answer. His form dissolved into the air, leaving nothing but the vast emptiness of the desert behind. Lena stood frozen, staring at the spot where he had been, a feeling of cold dread settling over her. Elliot exhaled sharply. We don't have a choice, do we? Lena shook her head slowly. No. We don't. Mark let out a bitter laugh. Great. So, we're on our own, hunting down some cosmic disaster that could tear the world apart. Fun. It's not about fun anymore, Lena said quietly. It's about survival. We have to find the source of the rift. We have to stop it, or we'll all be consumed by it. The group stood together, their faces grim, the weight of the keeper's words hanging heavily in the air. They had no idea what lay ahead. But they couldn't go back. Not now. They had to keep moving forward, deeper into the darkness. And as they turned toward the horizon, the ground beneath them seemed to hum with an ominous energy, as if the desert itself was watching them, waiting for them to take their next step. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an eerie golden hue over the desert. The air was thick with heat, but beneath that, there was something colder, an undercurrent of tension that made Lena's skin crawl. They had been walking for hours, no one saying much, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to process what the keeper had said. Lena's mind was a whirlwind. The information they had uncovered at Zone 51, the creature, the rift, it was all part of something far bigger than they could understand. And the keeper's warning still echoed in her ears, the rift has eyes. It is always watching. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, that every step they took brought them closer to something they couldn't outrun. We need to find shelter, Mark muttered, his voice hoarse. I don't care where, just somewhere out of the open. Lena glanced at him, nodding. She understood. They couldn't keep wandering through the desert aimlessly, not with the rift's presence still hanging over them. We can't afford to waste time, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We need to find out where the rift began. The keeper said to go to the source. That's our only chance. Claire, who had been walking quietly beside her, spoke up. But where do we even start? The whole desert is vast, and we don't even know if we're in the right place. Lena paused, glancing around at the empty landscape. The thought of wandering aimlessly was terrifying, but there was no other option. There has to be something. A place, a marker, something that can lead us to it. Lena's voice faltered for a moment, uncertainty creeping in. We just have to keep looking. Elliot, who had been walking ahead, suddenly stopped and turned back toward them, his face grim. I think I found something. The others hurried toward him, and Lena's heart skipped a beat as she saw what he was pointing at. There, barely visible against the desert floor, was a faint symbol etched into the ground. It was ancient-looking, its lines sharp and intricate, as though it had been carved into the earth by hands long forgotten. What the hell is that? Mark asked, stepping forward to get a closer look. Lena crouched beside the symbol, her fingers hovering just above it, feeling the strange energy that radiated from the marks. There was something about it that felt familiar, as if it was calling to her. She had seen something like it before, but where? I don't know, she said slowly, running her fingers along the symbol. But I think it's a marker. Maybe it's pointing us in the right direction. Elliot nodded. We need to follow it. They set off again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. The symbol led them across the desert, winding through rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. As they moved, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder with every step they took. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a place that seemed different. The landscape had changed. The desert was no longer a barren wasteland, instead, they stood in front of an ancient structure, half buried in the sand. The building was massive, its walls made of dark stone that gleamed in the dimming light. It looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries, yet there was something unsettling about it. The symbol they had been following was now etched into the stone, and Lena's gut twisted with a sense of foreboding. This is it, Lena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. This is where the rift started. The others gathered around her, staring at the structure in silence. No one moved, as if the place itself demanded their attention. It's like a temple, Claire murmured, her voice trembling. But who built it? And why is it out here, in the middle of nowhere? That's the question, isn't it? Mark said, his voice laced with unease. Who was here before us? Elliot stepped forward, his face set with determination. There's no time to waste. We need to go inside. Whatever this place is, it's our only lead. Lena nodded, but as she approached the entrance, a strange sensation washed over her. The air seemed to thrum with energy, like the building itself was alive, watching them. The entrance was dark, its doors ancient and weathered. Lena pushed one open, and they entered, stepping into the shadows of the unknown. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and a faint smell of decay lingered in the stale air. The walls were covered in more symbols, the same ones they had followed, each one more intricate than the last. This place is old, Claire whispered, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. I don't like it. Lena didn't respond, too focused on the symbols. There was something about them, something that felt like it was pulling her closer. And then, as if answering her unspoken question, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor and into her bones. "What is that?" Mark asked, his voice laced with fear. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it was all they could hear. It felt like it was coming from the very heart of the building, as though something was calling to them from deep within. Lena turned to the others, her eyes wide. "We need to find it. Whatever it is, it's inside." They moved forward, each step echoing in the vast, empty space. The hum guided them deeper into the heart of the structure, where they found a large chamber. The walls were adorned with strange carvings, depictions of creatures and symbols that didn't belong in any known language. In the center of the room stood an altar, dark and ancient, its surface covered in dust. And on the altar, glowing faintly, was a small object, a crystal, pulsing with an otherworldly light. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was important. It was the key. Before she could reach for it, a voice, low and menacing, boomed through the chamber, shaking the walls. "Foolish mortals," it snarled. "You have no idea what you've awakened." Lena froze. The voice was everywhere, filling the room, the very air itself. It wasn't coming from any one source, it was coming from the altar, from the walls, from the ground beneath their feet. The crystal began to glow brighter, and the ground trembled beneath them. "We've made a terrible mistake," Lena whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. And then the darkness closed in. The darkness swallowed them whole, a suffocating void that pressed in from all sides. The hum, the vibration, the pulse of the crystal, all of it intensified, resonating deep within Lena's chest. She could feel her heart racing, a primal fear clawing its way to the surface. "Move!" Lena shouted, her voice hoarse and panicked. But the room seemed to warp around them, the walls stretching and shifting as if reality itself was bending. The eerie voice reverberated through the chamber again, and Lena could almost feel it in her bones. "You have awakened something beyond your comprehension," the voice boomed. "The rift was never meant to be opened. You will never leave." Lena's breath hitched. She didn't understand, didn't know what it meant, but she couldn't think about that now. They had to survive. The crystal on the altar was glowing brighter by the second, and Lena felt a magnetic pull toward it, as though it was calling to her, begging her to touch it. Something told her that the moment she did, there would be no turning back. "It's the key," Mark gasped, staring at the crystal. "I think it's what caused the rift. We have to destroy it." But the voice seemed to mock them. "Destroy it," it sneered. "You cannot destroy what was never meant to be controlled. It is the heart of the rift. It is beyond your power." Lena clenched her fists, desperation rising in her chest. She had to find a way to stop it. There had to be a way. Elliot, ever the pragmatist, was already moving toward the altar. "We can't just stand here and do nothing. We need to." The moment he stepped closer to the altar, the ground beneath their feet shifted violently. The chamber groaned, and a crack appeared in the floor, splitting wide open. From the crack, a torrent of shadows poured out, swirling around them like a storm of darkness. Lena stumbled backward, her heart racing. The shadows were alive, writhing and coiling, seeking to devour everything in their path. "They're here," she whispered. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "We have to run." But it was too late. The shadows lunged at them, surrounding them in an instant. They tried to fight back, but every attempt only seemed to make things worse. The shadows were insatiable, feeding on their fear, on their very essence. Lena's vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt like the world was slipping away. Her head spun, and she could hear the voices, many voices, all speaking at once. "You should have stayed away. You will pay the price. The rift is eternal." Then, just as the shadows were about to consume her, something shifted. The crystal on the altar pulsed with blinding light, and the shadows recoiled, screaming as if in pain. "Do you feel it?" Claire gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "The crystal, it's trying to fight back." Lena's mind raced. There was a connection. The crystal was the source of the rift, but it was also the key to stopping it. They had to control it, use it against the rift itself. "It's connected to everything," Lena murmured. "The rift, the creatures, the void, it's all part of this crystal." Suddenly, the chamber was silent. The shadows had retreated, their whispers fading into nothingness. But the crystal was still pulsing, its light flickering erratically. The air felt charged, thick with energy. "I don't know how much time we have," Elliot said urgently. "We need to act now." Lena approached the altar, her hand trembling as she reached for the crystal. She felt its power, its raw energy surging beneath her fingertips. But as she touched it, the world seemed to tear apart. The ground beneath them rumbled, and the walls of the chamber cracked open. A deep, hollow sound reverberated through the air, and Lena could feel the rift growing wider, stronger. "We've awakened it," Mark said, his voice trembling. "It's coming for us." Lena's mind raced. There was no time left to hesitate. She couldn't destroy the crystal, but maybe she could force it to close the rift. "Stay back!" Lena shouted as she pushed forward, her hands gripping the crystal tightly. "I'll try to stop it. Get out of here if you can." But as the others backed away, something began to change. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. The shadows returned, darker than before, swirling around the room like a storm of pure malevolence. Lena's body trembled as she focused all her energy on the crystal. She could feel the power within it, ancient, unfathomable. It was like trying to hold back the tide. The rift had grown too large, too hungry to be stopped by anything so simple. And then, with a deafening roar, the crystal exploded in a burst of light. The world around them shattered. Lena felt herself being torn from reality, her body weightless as the ground beneath her vanished. Time itself seemed to slow, then stop entirely. She was falling, floating, suspended in an endless void. The whispers of the rift surrounded her, but they were no longer words, just endless, agonized wails, the sound of something dying, something that had never been meant to exist. For a moment, Lena thought she was gone, lost forever in the rift. But then, the light faded, and she found herself on solid ground once again. She opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness. The desert was still there, the vast, empty expanse stretching before her. But it was different now. The rift was gone. The creatures were gone. And the silence was absolute. Lena looked around, her heart pounding. The others were with her, standing in the same place, just as confused and shaken as she was. But there was no sign of the rift. No sign of the darkness. What happened? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Lena didn't know how to answer. She didn't know what had just happened, or how they had survived. But one thing was clear, whatever had come through the rift, whatever they had unleashed, was now gone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. But she knew that the truth, the full truth, would always linger. The rift had been closed. For now. But its mark would remain. And whatever had been unleashed, would always be watching.